or something.
Fine. Giraffe.
Yeah. Sure, yeah.
No, I got it. Yes, yes. No. Okay, that works. We're just going to give about another five minutes or so for people from upstairs to come up. So sorry about the delay.
Hvis vi går til Vinkanalen i Norge, så ligger det sånn YouTube-kanalen til Vinnorge, så ser du at det ligger sånn. Ja. I'm streaming live. If you want to spread the link, it's on the DN Norge YouTube channel. So we can just spread it to others who are not here. The recording is automatically also on YouTube. I'll kind of take care of more of that later on as well. So you know, if you have any questions, just let me know.
Okay, right. Right? Slide?
Okay, welcome back everyone. We're about to start with our next session, which is the future of work. First, I'd like to remind you of your concluding remarks. If you can either put them, maybe we can find a box, but if you can put them there, if you have any thoughts during the session, or downstairs at an example here, yeah, like that, or just give them to me, that would be good. So this session is chaired by Barb, and you already know Barb, and she works for welfare rights and as a welfare rights advisor in the UK, and she's worked on issues such as women's health, welfare, and housing for many, many years. And she's also the co-coordinator of Basic Income UK. Yeah, and also afterwards we'll have parallel sessions, and the parallel session on the pilot project that's been moved from Betong to Lillesalen, which is just one floor down. Yeah. Floor is yours, Barry.
Okay, just a little brief introductory remark, and we'll be talking about the future of work. Obviously, most people have heard about the rise of the robots and how that's going to take everything. But we'd also like to expand the discussion into various other areas. I'm really pleased with the panel. They all have some experience of, or some knowledge of what's going on. I'd also like to introduce into this subject as well the work we don't want. All right, it's something that when I'm doing public speaking, I'm always talking about, say people like George Osborne or Boris Johnson, which, if they would just only watch TV all day, it would really make the world a better place. Who wants to go first? Guy? Oh, okay. Well, James Bloodworth, who wrote a really fantastic book about his travels around the UK, and he'll talk about it now.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, cool. So for those of you who haven't read my book, I assume no one's read it, first of all. So sometimes that does happen with an audience, especially in a different country. So in 2016, I set out to travel around Britain and investigate the low-wage, precarious economy from the perspective of someone working inside it, working within it. So that entailed, for over 6 months, getting a range of kind of precarious, low-paid jobs in different companies. So from companies like Amazon to Uber, to working in call centers, to working on a building site, to working as a social carer, where you visit elderly people's homes and provide them with their care needs. And I'd done lots of jobs like this before when I was younger. So 10 years before, I'd been a kind of working class teenager. I'd done all kinds of work in factories, in bar work, petrol station, every kind of bus driver, postman, all of these kinds of jobs. And I wanted to go back 10 years later and see how the kind of what's called the gig economy, see how that had changed the world of work, and see how work had changed after the financial crisis of 2008. What we've really seen since that time is an explosion really in precarious work. Guy's written about this extensively, and I kind of wanted to paint that kind of picture from the shop floor, if you like, what it's actually like as a human being to be subject to those kind of forces, which have kind of come to the fore since the recession of 2008. So I worked in an Amazon warehouse, and that's probably the thing that's on the cover of the Norwegian version of my book, probably because that was almost the most shocking in some ways. So you had the biggest multinational in the world, headed up by the richest man in the world, where you were given disciplinary punishments for even things like taking a toilet break, for taking days off sick, even with a letter from the doctors. And it was such a kind of climate of fear around the place that at one point I discovered a bottle of urine on one of the warehouse shelves, where someone had urinated into an empty Coke bottle because they were so scared of going to the toilet because they were afraid that they would get the sack if they did this. And what was interesting, I guess, I realize I haven't got that long to talk about this. There was the gig economy in general. So we were on 0 hours, no guaranteed hours contracts at Amazon. And something I discovered later with Uber as well. With the gig economy, there's this whole language that's used to kind of blur the reality of what's going on in this world of work. So the gig economy itself makes it sound like something glamorous, like you're in a band or something, like you turn up to a gig when you please, you come and go as you please, and you're kind of, you put on your guitar, you're like a rock star. The reality is of the flexibility typically it's flexibility for whom? It's flexibility for your boss to decide when you can work, when you're going to work, and when you're not. And in Amazon, so we weren't allowed to call the warehouse a warehouse. We had to call it a fulfillment center. If you lost your job, you weren't fired or sacked. You were released. Or as we used to joke, you've actually been promoted to a customer. we weren't called workers or bosses or managers. You had to call everyone an associate. So Jeff Bezos, we were actually told this on the first day. Jeff Bezos is an associate and so are you. We're all one big happy family at Amazon. Never mind that over the course of a morning's work, I earned, I think it was like £26, while Jeff Bezos' share price went up several million. Uber, this was also true. So I worked as an Uber cab driver for 3 months in London. And all of this, we were kind of bombarded with all of this language when I got the job. When I joined Uber, you know, your freedom, autonomy, flexibility, be your own boss. If your wheels aren't turning, you aren't earning, blah, 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 all this shit. Sorry. But there was this kind of veneer of freedom, flexibility, whereas in reality, you were very tightly controlled by the company. So for this kind of, you were classed under the law as self-employed. So what this meant was you lost your right to holiday pay, sick pay, and a minimum wage. And for this sacrifice of your rights as a worker, you were your own boss, apparently. Yeah, in reality, you weren't. We were told by Uber that we couldn't pick and choose which jobs we accepted. We had to do whichever jobs Uber sent to us. We were even told what subjects we could talk about with the passenger in the back of our car. So we weren't allowed to talk about politics, religion, or sport, which, as a cab driver, there is literally nothing else you can talk about. But it's funny, but it's also absurd. And you were also the rating system. For those of you who've used Uber, there's like a rating system of 1 to 5 stars you can leave for a driver at the end of your journey. If your rating system as a driver fell below 4.7 stars, you would be threatened with deactivation, which was a euphemism for losing your job. 4.7 stars. I mean, people would leave you 4 stars if you didn't provide them free bottles of water in the car or let them hook up their Spotify to your car stereo. So at the end of the day, it felt like the passenger in the back of your car wasn't your customer, they were Uber's customer. And this veneer of kind of the gig economy had essentially been used as a ruse to offload business risk from Uber onto both their drivers, but also onto the taxpayer. So I also interviewed lots of people working for as self-employed contractors for companies like Deliveroo, and again Uber, like bicycle couriers, etc., who, because they were classed as self-employed, bogusly, in my opinion, when they would get sick or get injured, because bicycle couriering is a very physically arduous job, they would then sign on to receive benefits because they didn't receive sick pay. So then the state is picking up the tab as well for what traditionally would have been paid for by a traditional business. So just to kind of finish off, I guess, before passing on, because I've probably spoke for like 10 minutes already. As far as I saw it, I mean, flexibility is good if it means choice for you as a kind of as a worker. But what I saw in the gig economy traveling around the UK in 2016 was you'd seen since 2008 a huge offloading of risk from businesses onto workers and onto taxpayers to basically pick up the tab and carry the risk for things that would have been kind of borne by business in the past. Thanks for listening. I'll pass you on to the next speaker.
Next we have Becca Kirkpatrick, who's been now an organizer with Unison, and has been looking after her sister, and has been involved with Basic Income UK for about 4 years now, 5, something like that. Okay. Thank you, Bob.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me here at your conference this weekend. As Bob said, I'm one of the co-directors of Basic Income UK, and I am, just to clarify, I'm speaking here in a personal capacity this weekend. I thought just for my introduction I would start with a little quick sketch of my own work background and some of my perspectives on UBI, and then I'll also share what else to help with the panel discussion, what else I could talk about later and to help with your kind of questions. So I've also had quite a history through pretty much every different type of sector of work. I've spent quite a few years in the private sector minimum wage jobs. I've done some agency work. I then was lucky enough to get into the public sector for quite a few years. And as you'll know, that's a secure place to work with reasonably good conditions. And it was during that time that I became a trade union activist. Following about 10 years in the public sector, I then moved into the charity sector, where I was back on temporary contract. Most recently, I've also been working as a self-employed personal trainer. And I've been doing that through quite a large chain gym. So they have a model in some of these gyms where you actually work unpaid shifts, and you trade hours for rent to use the gym to teach your clients. So you work 15 hours a week for no pay at all. And again, you're not getting any sick pay, holiday pay, or any other rights like that through that time. And it's extremely hard, physically, long hours, lots of heavy lifting. So very recently, I have got myself a job for part of my week with the union that I was a member of previously. So I can no longer actually talk on behalf of the branch that I used to be part of. But I will come on to what my previous branch thought of UBI. And I'm also spent part of my week as an unpaid family carer for my disabled younger sister. And this was a big reason for my interest in UBI when I first heard about it around the time that the Swiss were getting ready for their referendum. So as family of someone receiving care, a UBI would not only allow me to be with my loved one more, but I've been obviously through that time very close up to people who work as paid carers, and I've seen what their job is like on the front line. And I firmly believe that the care industry needs complete transformation to allow people to reduce their hours and potentially job share, because working in care is one of the most exhausting and emotionally and physically demanding jobs that you can do. It has its high points, but you're getting people throw things at you, hit you, people who are confused, you're having to repeat yourself many times a day and motivate people just constantly throughout the day, with no chance to actually think about your own needs at that time. And as you know, it's one of the most poorly paid jobs that exists. Depending on where you are in the world, in Europe, we've got an aging population, and it's a job that's gonna the need for care is only going to increase, and it's not something that can be automated. So to my perspective, UBI is a massive part of us thinking about what does care look like in the future and how is it more equitably shared out. And also I have family members, my brother and husband, who've worked in construction also, or still do, and like James mentioned, there's a lot of bogus self-employment that goes on there, and workers denied the rights that they're entitled to. So when I was a union activist, my own branch in the charity sector, we took a position as a branch that we supported UBI. We had lots of care workers in our branch of 5,000 members, people who worked supporting disabled people, play, youth workers, that kind of thing. And so for several years, we did try and get a policy passed at national conference that Unison would also think UBI was something to look into. And we had just a quick snapshot of why our branch thought this was important. We had a group of nursery workers who, over Christmas time, just didn't get their wages paid. So they were working, they weren't entitled to any kind of social support as the system currently stands. And it was only because of the union being there and having a welfare fund that was able to support these people through the Christmas period. And obviously, if we had a basic income in place, then you could clearly see, and these workers could clearly see, how they would have not fell into that situation. So we tried several years to have the debate at conference. We never quite managed it before I left the branch. But we did get our own region of the union to become more aware of the policy, and we actually called the candidates for regional mayor in the West Midlands, where I'm from, Birmingham in England, to have a UBI pilot. And in fact, 2 of the candidates put it in their manifesto. Unfortunately, not the winning candidate, but we felt that was interesting. We got on page 2 of the business paper in Birmingham with our regional secretary saying that this was something we wanted as candidates to look at. So my own union that I was formerly part of doesn't have a view on this and is not even particularly future-minded. We're talking here about the future of work. So in preparation for coming here, I thought I needed to cast the net out a bit wider and speak to some other people. So some of you will know that unions around the globe have got a very mixed relationship with UBI. So for example, in Namibia and India, unions were actually part of having the pilots. When the ECI was happening, the unions in Bulgaria, I understand, were very significant in collecting signatures for that. Now, although policies have passed at 2 conferences of UK unions, both GMB and Unite, which are 2 of our biggest unions, the wider membership, to be honest, are really unaware of UBI, and some national officials actually speak against the policy, even though that motion was passed at conference. So, to guide some of the questions we might talk about from yourselves and in the panel, I spoke to 2 organisers. Nigel Flanagan, who's from UNI Global Union, and he leads the Amazon Alliance, which is all the different unions around the world that are organising in Amazon. I also spoke to Kulsoom Jaffrey, who's from the United Private Hire Drivers, which is a very small union that's getting going and winning lots of cases around Uber particularly and other sort of courier firms. And what I explored in my conversations was the kind of questions about why the unions might have differing positions on UBI, how they might feel about UBI, what is the context that explains why the unions have these positions, and what is the context for unions at this point in terms of where work's going to go. I mean, we saw the chief economist of the Finnish Union Federation say that UBI might cause mothers or those close to retirement to take more time off. Like that's a bad thing. You know, really, that baffles me. And then German union bosses have said that giving people money for nothing was no substitute for work. But as James has already outlined, we've got to ask the question, does that mean work of any kind? You know, what sort of work do we want? That's something worth delving into. So yeah, I'll save the rest, I think, for the debate. Anything that I don't get to cover today, it might come up in tomorrow's panel about the automation issue and work. Yeah, but hopefully I can shed a bit of light on these other people who are very knowledgeable about what's going on at the front line of work that illustrates and informs why the unions are taking the stance that they are at the moment. Okay.
Okay, Scott, do you want to go next? Okay. Scott needs very little introduction, I don't think. He's been Mr. UBI in the US for quite a while and talking about the future of work and various other issues around basic income.
So is this connected? Is this on? Yes. All right, good. All right, so I find myself being invited to a bunch of panels all over the place now about the future of work. And it's funny, I feel that a lot of questions aren't being asked about what that even means. I think that there's a whole lot of assumptions going on without really reimagining what work is, what we're even talking about. So I really want to ask some questions and get us to really question some of our assumptions. So first, when we're talking about the future of work, it's like we need to be thinking about there's like parentheses there that says the future of paid and unpaid work. So we don't really think about work as the form of unpaid work, and that's a problem, I think. I think that we synonymously combine jobs and work as the same thing. And I think that's a problem. Even like the way that we talk about it, we say like we went to work instead of like we went to a job. So like we were just talking about, say with care work, isn't it interesting how say you can go to work if you leave your kid at home as a parent and then someone else comes in to take care of your kid, and that's called work. but you went to work, and if you would have stayed to watch your own kid, that would not be considered work, when obviously it is work. So we need to really question, when we're talking about the future of work, that there's more to work than employment. Jobs are a subset of work. And you can even create subsets out of jobs where you've got meaningful jobs and meaningless jobs. And I find that still a lot of these kind of panels that I'm going to, it's like people are talking about with great consternation, without saying it, of the future of meaningless jobs. I think that's part of the problem here, is that we're really concerned about what's going to happen to all these jobs that may be entirely meaningless. I mean, worldwide, only 15% of employees all over the world are actually engaged by their work. In the US, it's a third. So there's a whole lot of people doing stuff that they just don't care about. So and then another part of this question of the future of work, there's a time component. Imagine like a subscript beneath work, where we're assuming, I feel, that 40 hours is this handed down on stone kind of time where you just, you work 40 hours per week. That's what a job is. And it's funny, if you go back in time a bit, you can actually see some great quotes from people when normal was 60 hours per week. And one of the quotes I liked was that referring to people who wanted to work 5 days a week instead of a 6-day week, was that they should be ashamed as like lazy mollycoddles. And I feel that we need to have that time component back in the conversation. Here we are, we're worried about, say, half of our jobs being automated, and it doesn't make that much sense. If half of our work can be automated, then why would we have a situation where half of us are unemployed instead of everyone working half as much and everyone having just as much employment to go around? So I think we need to get back to that and really talk about the time component and say, why are we working 40 hours a week? Why is that normal? Let's go to a 4-day work week. Let's look at 6-hour days. Let's look at 6 months on, 6 months off, a year here and there at a time instead of all like 20 years worth of work. I think another question to ask too is, when we're talking about the future of work, thinking about like the past of work. What did work used to be like? Say like pre-Taylorism, pre the invention of cutting stuff up into tasks. People used to be more holistic. You could have like a shoemaker who made a whole shoe. And now we're at the point where you just chop it up into tasks, and you'd say you were working in a factory making shoes and you're just doing one little thing. And now robots are doing that. And I think we're gonna be able to get back to this kind of older thinking of work where it's actually, you can create whole things, and that's more engaging. You care more about that. And I think another component too is not only thinking about the future of work, but thinking about the future of consumption that it's not really talked about as much. Like if you read a great essay from Bertrand Russell called In Praise of Idleness, it's like we're talking about like the future of bread making without even thinking about the future of eating bread. It's like, why are we making all this stuff if there's no value in actually enjoying it? We need time to actually enjoy this stuff, and there is value in actually enjoying this stuff. It's amazing how people make fun of the idea of a bunch of people, say, using their time and their basic income to play games. And it's like, there's a whole lot of work involved in making these games. So what's the point of it all if we can't play them? So I think that part of that too is thinking about leisure and play, and actually questioning if instead of just thinking about work as a way of earning income, it's a way of creating purpose and meaning with each other, and actually doing things for each other that are important. So it's those kind of questions that I want us to ask, and hopefully we can get into that a little bit today too, as we think about the future work, to really just question all these assumptions.
Guy? Got your, yeah. Guy?
Hi, thanks very much. I've been arguing for, I don't know, many years, that we should be very careful about the words that we use, not worry about others. And here we are falling into the trap calling it the future of work. It'd be much better if it was the future of work and labor, because the distinction between labor and work is a vital distinction to make. And I think the whole subject is so crucial to our agenda that we have to be very, very careful. I don't like the term gig economy that you've used, and you said you don't like it. Well, let's not use it. Let's not fall into the trap of using the words that they would like us to use, because we continue with the imagery if we do that. It's a question of platform capitalism. Now, platform capitalism is part of the globalizing labor process at the moment, which is, as we know, controlled by apps, the private equity corporations, which are manipulating and creating a globalized labor process. And therefore, what is actually happening is that no national labor market continues in the form of the textbooks, because actually an employer increasingly has access to workers, or taskers as I call them, at every part of the world. And you can often find that online is being done, and the apps and certain people are essentially modern labor brokers. That's part of the globalizing labor process. And it goes with the growth of the global precariat, and we're going to talk about that later, so I don't want to speak about it too much. But then you come to the subject of automation and the whole question of the role of robots. And I believe here too, we are failing to open up the vocabulary, and we allow it to be seen as a simple question. Are the robots going to replace human beings as workers, and a whole lot of people are going to be made redundant? Well, that's very simplistic, because if you think about it, our technological progress, if that's the word you want to use, has been accelerating. And we should remind ourselves that so far we've had a huge increase in robots, but the employment level in the world today is at higher than any point in history. In the United States, they have record levels of employment. In Britain, they're talking about the highest level of employment ever and the lowest unemployment for 30 years. And yet robots have been entrenched all over the place. What's going on? It's not a displacement in the classic sense. We call it the lump of labor fallacy among economists. But it has been incredibly disruptive. And that's the feature that we should be emphasizing. The technological changes that we're experiencing are increasing the insecurities of people, the volatility of income, the volatility of developing yourself as a worker. You're going to be displaced and pushed into something else. And in actual fact, more interesting for our agenda than automation as such is a new phenomenon which has hardly received any attention in the public, except that there are wonderful studies taking place mainly by engineers and physicists and so on. It's called heteromation. Now, the interesting thing about heteromation is that this is the first technological revolution in history where you can genuinely say it is creating more work than labor. It's genuinely creating a vast increase in the amount of time people spend in work that is not labor. That's a remarkable trend. Now, if there's anybody in this room who's working, not Labour notice, working less today than they were 20 years ago, I'd like to have a chat with you because I don't know how you do it. Because most of us spend vast amount of time doing work that is not Labour. And you pay a heavy price if you don't do that work. And if you're in the precariat, there is a vast amount of time that you have to spend doing work that is not Labour. Work for the state, work for looking for jobs, work for this, work for retraining, work for your networking, etc., etc., etc. And that, I think, is an important issue for the basic income community. Because if we have to do a lot of activities that are work but not Labour, you're not being compensated, are you? But you have to do it. And this leads to my main point that I want to make this afternoon, which is developed in my book on the corruption of capitalism. I wanted to call that book Rentier Capitalism. And the publisher said, you can't call it rentier capitalism, nobody will understand that, nobody will buy the book. And they read it, and they said, oh, well, it's about corruption. And I said, no, it's not about corruption. And then I said to myself, yes, it is. Because fundamentally, they're claiming they're having a free market economy, but it is the most unfree market economy that we've got today that's ever existed. And the primary characteristic of what's happened in the last 25 years is we've had a morphing from a free market neoliberalism to rentier capitalism. Why is that relevant about the future of work? Well, essentially what's been happening is that more and more of the income has been going to the owners of physical property, financial property, and intellectual property. They're rentiers, extracting the income. And what's been happening is that anybody relying on wages has had a diminishing part of the pie, globally and nationally. And that leads back to this globalizing labor process, because what's actually been happening is not only has that extraction by the rentiers been taking place, and that wages in real terms have been declining in all OECD countries, but that has been going along with increased volatility, increased insecurity, and most importantly, again, for our discourse, is increased economic uncertainty, for which you cannot have a social insurance system, either the Beveridge type or the Bismarckian type. The old systems of social security do not work in those circumstances. And this leads to the final point that I want to make in this introductory comment. That what has been happening, and I really think we should take this theme because it opens up the basic income need, is that our income distribution system has broken down, and there's been a deconstruction of what I've called social income. So that if you're in the precariat, which is the growing class, you are losing access to non-wage benefits. You're losing access to state benefits. You're losing access to the commons. You're losing access to private benefits and leaving yourself dependent on a volatile, declining wage, which is increasing things like the poverty trap and so on. Whereas the rentiers, the plutocrats, the elites, and the salariat, and the unionized part of the proletariat have been getting increasing parts of rent in one way or the other. And this means that strategically we have a challenge, because if you're proposing a basic income, you need an alliance of class groups. So we have to find the vocabulary and the agenda for reconstructing the income distribution system and appealing to other groups for part of that process. I'll end by saying that I've just completed a report for Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, which is going to be issued on May the 7th, May the 8th. And anybody who's in Britain who would like to come to the launch and give me some support, because there will be MPs, the media, and various critics of basic income. It will be launched in London, so anybody who's in Britain then is welcome to come along. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Guy, and perfect. Thank you, everyone, for keeping your presentations short and sweet. Yeah, so maybe I think, Guy, you made the distinction between work and labor. I would say maybe work and jobs, is that correct, or no? Okay, so could you explain a little bit more about the difference between work and labor and in...
The traditional Marxian distinctions between labor and work and labor power, I think are very important. In the Precariat books, I've developed that. Labor is the activity that has exchange value. Usually it's done for a wage, okay?
Okay, so what...
Labor,
Yeah, okay.
labor, it can be done in employment, where you have a stable, long-term employment. But the notion of a job, and that's why I agreed with what you were saying beforehand, traditionally in the language, English language, a job was something you didn't want to do. A job was a bits and pieces thing that was used in a negative sense. If you were doing a job or a job holder, you were a pretty low level thing.
You could even be a job's worth.
Occupation is the opposite of job. Occupation where you're developing yourself, and it's linked to the notion of labor power. The Marxian sense of we have capacities, latent and actual, which we develop through our life. You want a sense of occupation. I talked to David Graeber about this. You want a sense of occupation rather than having to do lousy dead-end jobs. Which he writes about. But I think that, again, we ought to mock jobs and romanticizing having as many people as possible as jobs. That's crazy.
Okay, thanks. I just also a note, all right, about this high proportion of people in employment in the UK. You're counted as being in employment in the UK if you do 1 hour a week. Okay, so that's really what we're talking about. Does anyone else want to contribute to this job versus or work versus labor discussion?
Yeah. Something else I wanted to touch on is so when I talked also about the future of consumption, and especially I'm also kind of assuming here I am asking us to not make assumptions, and I'm going to make the assumption that we have basic income in the future because it's so important to future everything. But what's really interesting about basic income from that perspective of a, say, almost a post-capitalist perspective, is that people are more and more able to do work for free, and then people are able to since they're not paying for that, then they can enjoy that for free. You're removing the cost from the equation. And I find myself doing that since I have a crowdfunded basic income, that I'm able to, say, write for free. I don't really care about attaching a price to it, and I'd rather just put it out into the, to the commons for people to enjoy all over the world without having to worry about copyright. And this really opens it up that you can actually remove that money part of the equation, and people can actually do stuff for each other out of enjoyment. And you're already seeing that right now. Like, I think YouTube is a great example where so many people are just creating just so much content on YouTube, and then so many people are consuming that content on YouTube, and there's no money being exchanged between them. So I think in the future, with the basic income, we could do even more of that, where we can actually really choose to not be part of the whole selling our work for money thing. That can actually be an actual choice, where work can really be much more intrinsically motivated instead of extrinsically motivated.
Thank you. James, I just wanted to ask you with, all the kind of different precarious types of work that you did and talking to people and stuff, how did people see that changing, or how did they see the future of their lives?
How do they see the future of their lives with the kind of
Yeah.
I think you almost can't with the kind of insecurity of it. So in one of the town I lived in where I worked for Amazon, Amazon was the biggest employer in the town, followed by a company called Argos and then Tesco. And all of the like shop floor level jobs were temporary 0 hours contract jobs. So at Amazon, we were told when we joined that the words they used would be under no illusions, this is a temporary job. And from people I interviewed who worked for the other big employers in the town, it was a similar story. So you couldn't for sure plan beyond 9 months because that was when your contract would end. You could expect your contract to end then. But you'd even be lucky to make it that far anyway because of the disciplinary procedures I mentioned at Amazon were such that you'd probably lose your job before then anyway, on the basis that you've taken too many toilet breaks or you've taken too many days off sick. So if you took 6 days off sick, you would lose your job automatically, whether you had a note from the doctors or not. And this was a great change in this time compared to what had existed previously. So 20 years before Amazon had arrived in 2011, the coal mine in the town had closed. And now, obviously, you don't want to romanticize working in a coal mine because there's a plaque in the town where people, in memory of people who died in the coal mine. Everyone there knew someone who'd been killed in an explosion or pit collapse. People had lost limbs, etc., etc. But even in that job, there was a sense of stability. So you could get a mortgage on the job there. There was a trade union. There was a sense that you could have like a job for life if you wanted it. And there was also a sense of identity attached to the work itself. Thank you. Almost eating the wires there. Yeah, there was a sense of identity attached to the work itself, which is something that's we sometimes forget with jobs. So one of the former miners in the town said to me, he said one day, I see lots of younger people around the town and they say, I only work at Amazon. And he said, I would never say I'm only a collier because you were proud of it and it was what you were. And I find that really interesting around the question of identity. So we have an identity in society. We're encouraged to have an identity in society today attached much more to what you consume as a consumer. Whereas if you go back a generation, it was as a producer. So even though you were very often working in a fairly exploitative job, there was still like an identity that was to some extent empowering attached to that work. Whereas if you're working for Amazon, you're so tightly controlled both by kind of automated processes. So you're controlled by an algorithm that you essentially have no autonomy whatsoever. There are no trade unions. There are none of those institutional affiliations of the past, which gave a working class person that sense of empowerment. So just to quote like Trotsky, the Isles of proletarian democracy. I quote him because that's a very good way of putting it. Those kind of small areas within a capitalist economy where as a worker you can exercise autonomy, and a trade union would be a good example. Or even something like a social club, which is democratically run by its members. Within those areas of Britain and Western Europe and America where you've seen industry disappear over the last 30 or 40 years, you've also seen a culture be destroyed with it. And that was the culture of kind of solidarity and organization. And that's had a big impact as well on the jobs that have come, the jobs that have followed industry, the precarious jobs, the Amazon warehouses, the Uber, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thanks. So Becca, then over to you you were talking about union organizers who are trying to unionize in similar types of work. I mean, what sorts of ways are they doing that, and what did you find out?
Okay, that's a great question. Is this, you can hear? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it's true that...
Actually, could you use this
Yeah.
mic, because that mic is really... Yeah. Turn it on, yeah. Hello? Yeah.
Okay. What's very interesting, just taking firstly the example of Amazon, is that unions are taking quite different approaches in different parts of the world. So towards the end of this month, in Berlin is a meeting of the Amazon Alliance, and that is now including unions from the US, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Poland, the UK. It started out as about 11 to 18 people from 6 unions, and it's now going to be 80 delegates this year. I missed out also Mexico, Jordan, India, Australia, Canada, all going to be represented as well. And at the same time that meeting is happening, Verdi, the German union that's been trying to do some organising in Amazon, will be on strike at that time as well.
Right, but you just slow down slightly.
Yeah, so no problem, sorry. Within this spread of unions across different countries in the same employer, it is actually great that they're coordinating, they are taking action simultaneously in different countries. And we saw that happen with the Italian, Spanish and French unions coordinating with German workers who struck on Black Friday. Also with the example of the Polish Amazon workers who are now refusing to move any German orders from a fulfillment center that's right next to the German border. So the Amazon bosses are trying to think a few steps ahead, and then so are the workforce, which is great to hear. But there is a kind of a tactical debate very much happening within the labour movement about Amazon and similar forms of work. And it comes down to a choice about resources ultimately. So one approach is, and we saw this somewhat with you may have seen the recent campaign about Amazon trying to put headquarters in New York State. And there was a big effort to prevent that happening. And a lot of kind of legislative approaches were taken to kind of harass the company to the point where they didn't feel welcome or able to carry out their business, or where that's not possible, where the company will actually grant a union some sort of presence, or they'll take a neutral stance on the union. That would be one approach. And what I gathered from my research prior to coming here is that's still really resource intensive. That takes a lot of money and smart people's headspace and time to take that approach. The other approach is purely and simply to still see it as an organising challenge, which means that mobilising the workforce, or the workforce coming together to disrupt the flow of capital for the company. And that likewise needs a big injection of resources. So it's not really possible to do both. And that's going to be a big, right now, it already is a big conversation that's having to happen. And, it is very fair to say that Amazon is highly anti-union, and in most places they do succeed in preventing any kind of union organising. But, I mean, there's a book called Strike Strategy that was written, I think, in the 50s, and aside from the back few pages, very moving pages, a list of workers' names that have died in industrial struggles with employers. The page that really struck out for me in that book was a table that explained how a century ago employers were literally stockpiling weapons to use on the striking workforce. And so, you can see the parallel. I think the kind of the form of warfare has changed, but that conflict is, is still going out, and that's not a new thing. So it's a case for the union movement to need to decide where it's going to place its resources at this point and in the future to have the maximum impact. And there's a lot at stake because we all know that union membership is declining constantly, and the age of union membership is constantly rising, as in unions are mostly, especially the established unions, are mostly run by older men and women who are going to come out of the workforce, and younger people are not being as attracted into unions. And some interesting reasons for those might be what sort of function the unions see themselves having. So there's very much a temptation for, I think, unions to focus very tightly on what they can bargain from their employer, their respective employer. And a really interesting example that Nigel gave me was how the US unions, they don't see it as their role to argue for socialised universal healthcare for the whole population. What they would prefer to do is bargain for a better private health insurance deal from the employer. On the flip side, a bit of a contradiction is that unions do see it as their role to campaign against violence against women, whether that's in the workplace or at home. So there are times when unions do see themselves as having a broader social function. And so Nigel gave a quote to me that he'd been doing some work with people in Russia, and he said that a lot of young people don't feel like they want to join unions now because they're not real unions. And what he meant by that is that 50 years ago, if you had a problem with like your house or your local school, the union could actually help to sort that out. Whereas now they've kind of shrunken in what they conceive of as their own position. So younger activists are more drawn towards organisations such as Acorn in the UK that are able to help with a landlord as much as any other situation that's going on in your life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. And also, I would just also bring up the kind of organizing that's going on in the US with teachers, where they have really kind of extended their fight about perhaps, it is partly about their wages, but then they're really saying, look, okay, we don't have enough teachers to be able to teach well, all right? Or we don't, and talking about the ways that their jobs actually affect the community. So, yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to say something a bit extra, and then I'll go to the floor, or do you want to hear questions from the floor? Yeah.
Let the floor. There is something I want to come back on.
Okay, yeah, so if you could take a mic.
Yeah, I would like to say something.
Yeah, before we go to the floor? Okay.
Me?
Yeah.
First, yeah? First of all, again, I've sort of taken my role this afternoon is to emphasize the importance of the words and concepts that we use for our discourse. And I want to come back to this idea of precarious work. It's a term I've come to hate with a passion because it's wrong in both senses of the term. When people talk about precarious work, they're talking about labor, the jobs. But the important thing, and I've been saying this for 20 years now, and I don't seem to succeed very well, is that the notion of the precariat, which is so important, and that's why I wrote the book, The Notion, is about what precariat and precarity mean. And it's not the same thing as unstable or insecure labor. When people talk about precarious work, they're talking about insecure, unstable labor. The notion of the precariat comes from the Latin to obtain by prayer. And what that means is that if you're in the precariat, you feel you are a supplicant. You have to ask for favors. You have to hope for some discretionary judgment. You have to please a bureaucrat. You have to please a parent. You have to please a partner in order to get an entitlement. Please, you're a beggar. And that's so important because millions and millions of people are being put into that position today. They're lacking agency, they're lacking subjectivity, and they're lacking a sense of control of the way they develop as human beings. And it's obviously crucial for understanding for us for the basic income, because what we're against is the begging society. What we're against is precarity. And therefore we should use the terms as they are. We're talking about unstable, insecure labor. That's bad enough. But that is distinct from being in the precariat. And if I talk to a precariat group, they get it. And the unions, unfortunately, if I still talk about the labor unions, that's the best way of driving the precariat to the nearest bar, to have a few drinks. Because they believe the labor unions, just their answer is to put people back into jobs.
full-time jobs, stable jobs, good jobs, full employment.
Whereas the aspirations of the precariat is much closer to our romantic aspects of basic income. And therefore, that's why the terminology is so important in the way we present it and the way we articulate our agenda. So that's the point I want to make.
Thank you, Guy.
I would actually even just add on to that.
Your microphone is.
I just have to turn me on.
There we go.
I would even just add on to that, yeah. So the words we use are so important. And I think one of the best words that Guy has used as a result of the observations of like even the experiment in India is the word emancipatory. Because emancipatory is essentially people getting off their knees. And this is, you're not begging anymore, it's a real sense of freedom. And that's why the unconditionality is so key to basic income. People focus so much on the money and the amount of money, but it's not. It's the unconditionality is where the real power of basic income comes from. And a big part of that is its emancipatory potential, what it actually enables people to achieve. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention too, that I think specific examples really help people to get their minds going. So I just wanted to give say one or two examples of say the future of work, like what kind of position it would be. So one of these kind of future things, just there's something in New Orleans where I'm from. It's called the Jazz Brunch. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that, but it's something it's fun to go to, that you can go to brunch and then listen to a live band while you're eating food. And of course, brunch is all over the place, but no one advertises the fact that they have like some music overhead. We automated music a long time ago, but there's no great value to eating a brunch with the radio playing overhead. The value is in people. So I think that in the future, especially when we have a basic income, that there's gonna be even more value in that kind of thing. You can have more people playing music at a place that actually adds value to that people actually enjoy that experience more because of that human touch. So I just want to consider what other kind of examples can you think of these kind of jobs that people could do that we don't necessarily think of in that way, that could actually really add a more of a human touch to the future.
Great, thank you. All right, I'd like to open up to the floor now. People with questions. I will cut you off if you're not short, so you've been warned.
Very short. Andrew Yang, who is running for President of the United States on the Democratic primaries, has used the word freedom dividend instead of UBI. And I'd just like to have members of the panel comment on the appropriateness of this vocabulary.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, go Yang Yang. And yeah, I think it's very clever, as he has even plainly stated, that to like doing some surveys and polling and testing to see what worked. Freedom dividend just plain worked. Like people they hear that and then they're able to think about it in a different way. They got the freedom part, which as far as America goes, they love at least the idea of freedom. And and they love the idea of a dividend. It's very capitalistic, it's friendly, it's a way of receiving income detached from work that's considered to be fine. So freedom dividend, I think it was a smart way to do it. And even if you look at universal health care and Medicare for all, so it's like universal basic income is the concept, like universal health care is, but you can call it all kinds of things as far as the program goes. So instead of Social Security for all or something, then he said, yes, the freedom dividend. And I think it's working pretty well.
Yeah, just for my own part, I have to say that when I'm speaking to people on the street or people who've never heard about basic income, probably the second thing out of my mouth is that it's like a dividend. All right. So I mean, I just and people get that straight away.
When you next see him, will you ask him to send me the rent? Because I made the proposal for freedom dividend to Nelson Mandela in 1995. And I wrote an allegorical piece, which was published because I presented it to Desmond Tutu, saying that this would be a wonderful way of changing the income distribution system in South Africa, because Mandela had that fantastic mandate, and it was the only way to redistribute white capital to make sure that blacks had it. And I wrote this allegorical thing, what happened when it was introduced. So I agree with Bob. I think, and that's why my report for the Labour Party is basic income as common dividends. Because I think dividends is another word that is really one that we can use to make, and we were talking about that in India as well. So I really think that more of us should use that term.
Any other thoughts about this, James? No. Okay, next question.
You can hear me? Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for a great conference. This is my first basic income conference in Sardinia, 1990, where I met Guy, I remember. And I have a point that I would like to pick up with you. Very interesting thing on the welfare state, which is kind of my main interest. You say something like the welfare state does not work in this new economy. Well, I agree, but I'm afraid it can easily be a question of mismatch, a bit functional understanding of the relationship. And you say beverage doesn't work, Bismarck doesn't work, but beverage is not beverage anymore, and Bismarck is not Bismarck after the Hartz reforms. So we need to look also at the politics of change, that the welfare state is changing not because of the new labor market, but because of politics. That's also changing, contributing to change the new labor market by curtailing access to welfare. The parallel to 1834 and the last big transformation is quite clear here when we look at the beginning of the industrial age. My question to you is, can the welfare state as it is today be reformed to better protect people in the new economy? Or is the alternative a basic income for all the income maintenance part, leaving outside the services of the welfare state?
Okay, can I just ask, James, do you have any thoughts about that? Because yeah, okay.
I think someone who can speak about the welfare. I mean, I can add one. Yeah. So, I mean, there's the weird thing is with that, in kind of the tail end of the new Labour government in England talked about welfare in terms of moving it more towards a contributory model at a time when work was moving in the opposite direction, where you needed that consistent kind of universality of welfare, where you could be much more likely to be in and out of work in quick succession, where there is much more need for something like UBI, where as a worker it gives you the power to say no, if that makes sense, to terms and conditions which aren't to your liking, whereas politics has been moving in almost the opposite direction. Maybe that's something to do with the crisis, whereas when there is a crisis, typically blame tends to fall on, in Britain at least, migrants or people on social security. But that is an interesting thing. We need to go the other way, to back towards universality, whereas in politics it's been moving, in Britain at least, in the opposite direction.
Anyone else? Guy? Yep.
Yeah, as the question was directed, I apologize for answering. Both the Beveridge type of system and the Bismarckian system, which were the dominant trends in the development of welfare states, were based essentially on an industrial capitalist society model, in which, and I recently had to reread Beveridge's 1942 report, which is epoch-defining for the post-war era, and you really feel embarrassed to read large parts of it. It is such a sexist document. It has this model where men are in jobs, full-time jobs, where they have temporary interruptions of earnings power and we must look after them. and women are housewives. It's called category 4. So for much of the text, he says those in category 4, which implies they're all women. And it of course, it ignores all forms of work that are not labor, ditto with the Bismarckian model. So for me, those models, while they were progressive at the time, let's be fair, while they were progressive at the time, for the 1950s, and Bismarck earlier, obviously, today they are disgraceful. I wouldn't want to go back to those models. And I think that they cannot deal with the crucial phenomena that I was trying to talk about earlier, of precarity. They've moved more and more into turning more people into the precariat. It's the system that does that. As James has just said, universal credit in Britain has gone to the furthest point in that. It's workfare. And it's so demeaning and punitive and sanctioned. It's morally bankrupt. Not whether it's thing. And that's the last point I want to make in this conversation. I genuinely believe that it's important that we don't put basic income as an anti-poverty mechanism. It is, but it's much more important that it's confronting things like insecurity, precarity, the ecological challenge. Don't focus on its anti-poverty characteristics. There are many ways of dealing with poverty, but it has an emancipatory trajectory that is far more important than that implies.
Thank you.
I would just like to add to this as well, just to think about basic income as a floor and as a foundation, and it's missing. So when we think about traditional safety nets and these kinds of things, it's like we built a house without a foundation, and then people are saying, we're all saying, we need to build a foundation. And then some people were responding, you can't sleep on only a foundation. It's like, well, yeah, so you have a foundation and then you put walls around it and you have your roof on top and that's a house. That's how you were just saying that we did not include the foundation from the very beginning. And that was a mistake. And it's becoming increasingly clear as precarity increases that these ideas of conditional safety nets are just completely ill-suited for where we are right now and where we're going.
I'd just like to add also, though, that those systems, I mean, because they're household-based, are also very anti-women or anti the person who does most of the care work in the household. I spent a long time in something called the Wages for Housework campaign, and we talked a lot, and now I also meet many older women who use child benefit, which was as close as the UK has ever got to a basic income, where each child gets so much a week. They use their child benefit, some of them to escape bad marriages or escape violent partners, but some of them actually, it was the only money they had to actually feed their children, because whatever the husband was bringing home, he wasn't giving it to their wives. And so for me, one of the really key points about basic income is that it goes to each individual and not the household. Anyway. Right, any other, okay.
Yeah. My question is to Guy and Scott on this question of distinction between work and labor and other such concepts. For example, Wikipedia actually came and disrupted this whole couple of industries, and it's contributed entirely by people who don't get paid in that paid work sense. Now, going beyond this profit and non-profit sector, in fact, non-profit is derived from the profit sector, is there a possibility, can we imagine in future a Wikipedia kind of a model, not just, to provide care services in the public domain, rather than when we talk about care labor, we talk only in the private domain. Is it possible to imagine a future of a care sector where actual services that are required for people can be provided in that kind of a model, where we are saying that when people get a basic income, they would not want to go for full-time paid work, all the time paid work. They would like to do many things that they would like to do. So I'm just asking you, can we imagine that?
Yeah, so the first thing that it makes me think of is, and this is even, we've observed this kind of result from basically experiments like in India, where you say, you have that, what is it, the lending wheel, where everyone puts in an amount of money and then it circulates around, so one person gets the lump sum, and then the next person gets a lump sum, and the next person gets a lump sum. So that was something that emerged as something that people use that money for. And I think that when you look at care work, you could essentially do the same thing. So you would have, say, you would watch, you should watch kids or elderly or something for, say, 1 day a week. And then someone else would do a day, and then someone else would do a day. So it'd be like a care wheel where you're able to do that, and you're not spending any money. You're just saying, like, I'm going to do this little point, this little part of it, and then we have a small group, and you trust everybody in that group because it's a small enough group, so you trust everybody doing the care work. And then you're not spending money on that anymore. No one's getting paid. It's very bad for GDP, of course, but it's great for everybody else.
There are a lot of things that are in that statement that you've just made. Care work is what many of us would like to have done more of during our life. Women have been forced to bear the burden of providing the care to a large extent, but most of us, as we get older, wish we'd been able to spend more time caring for our children, caring for our elderly parents, caring for the community in which we lived, etc. That care work we obviously see as linked to basic income, because basic income gives you more ability to make a choice at the margin, whether we spend more time doing that sort of care and less doing resource depleting labor, etc. But you're also talking about the care sector. And here I think it's very important again for our agenda to remember that there are two what I call meta securities. We need basic security. We need that anchor or floor, but we also need voice. And it's very, very important in thinking about care that the caregivers need voice, need agency, individual and collective, because among carers, the gift relationship easily turns into self-exploitation and self-oppression. I'm not doing enough. You feel under stress. You feel you've got to do the obligation. I've seen that. It's very dangerous for everybody. But you also need care voice for the care recipients who are extremely vulnerable. But you also need voice, agency for the people in the middle, the people who are the agents, the intermediaries, who are also stressed out. High mental collapse of social workers who are trying to link up the carers and the care recipients. So it opens up the need for that voice. And we should always emphasize that, I think, the saying, yes, we need basic income, but we need to strengthen voice. And that comes back to Becker's agenda. We need to see a transformation of the unions, not the defeat of the unions. We need unions. It's just that they have to be geared in different directions. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Becca, do you have anything else to say on that? I know you said a really useful thing before about how you really want, and the carers that look after your sister, that you really want them to want to be doing that. And there's a way that, certainly in care work or care labor at the moment, people who are paid to do care work, it's often falling on people that that's really their only choice is to do care work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a huge amount to add to what's being said there, but definitely, I think a lot of what makes care work so difficult and potentially crushing is the duration that's expected. 40 hours a week versus potentially 3 hours a week, or it starts to look like a really different thing. Someone can really bring their energy and creativity to doing that role. People might, choose that it's something they would like to do as part of their week, among other things also. And I also think it links well with the conversation around a lot of people in response to hearing about basic income say, oh, you know, no one will do the unpleasant jobs. How are we going to get those to be done? Which firstly indicates that at the moment we have to compel people to do them through the fear of starvation. So that's not a great reality that we have at the moment. But yeah, if we could, if we wanted to, think about how do we organise society whereas, you know, either things are paid better and therefore more attractive in that sense, or the time that everyone is involved in having to do certain things that we need but perhaps don't enjoy so much, we chunk it out and we have some kind of system where we each get a turn at doing a mixture of things we love and things that we don't love so much, but it's limited and bounded. And I think there's definitely ways and examples we could draw on that could be done if we had the will.
Anything else?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Okay, I'd actually take a woman if that's all right, because we've had a bunch of men. And I'm just going to discriminate. Sorry about that. Yeah,
Sorry. My name is Manja, I'm from Germany, and I've got a question for you, Becca. So for us individuals, we've been invited to fantasize about what our life would be like with basic income a lot. Have people who work for unions been doing that? And what are their ideas of what they've come up with? What will my work in the union be like when all my members have basic income?
That's a question and a half.
Oh, wow. Okay. I really cannot speak for everybody who works for a union. I myself have only worked for a union since December. I can't speak on behalf of the union at all as a functionary of the union. Now the members determine what the union wants to do, and I am at their mercy and will. So I can't comment there. What I can say is that as I've already mentioned, there's a range of views. You know, there's people who work for unions who are very pro basic income, and equally that are vehemently against it. But the ultimate direction of unions is in truth is set through a combination of what the members want and what people working in unions want. I also already mentioned the age profile of unions is perhaps not in match step with the demographic profile of society and people's, the wider views of basic income that we're seeing coming out through polls and other examples. I wanted to highlight a really interesting how the debate around the national minimum wage in the UK, when that first was gathering some strength, pretty much all the unions were very against it and said it's going to undermine collective bargaining. But Rodney Bickerstaff, who was the leader of what became Unison, the public service union, he was a kind of lone voice in championing this for many years, and he was really isolated from the other unions until it became policy, and now it's absolutely ingrained into the established norms of society, and even the Conservative Party in the UK think, yes, this is something that should continue. And so the position that we see the unions take may change. It may lag behind broader societal views, but all I would say is that it's very much a mixture of opinions, and that debate's going on. I think there's a lot of space in the UK for that debate to go further. And in fact, the debate around the future of work it's very early days. Most unions are passing policies saying, oh, we need to start looking at automation, we need to start thinking about it, let's start to form a view rather than having a view. That's where it is at this point. Oh yeah, okay, so yeah, one thing that several unions we're seeing now are they are talking about alternative policies that they want to push forward rather than a basic income. So shorter work week is one. The TUC has now got that as an official policy. That's the Federation of Unions in the UK, and we've seen other European unions actually taking strike action for a shorter work week. And of course, unions will talk about bolstering up the welfare state or expanding public services. My own personal view is that these very much could go together. It's not an either or, but we're more often seeing those either pushed as an alternative, a preferable alternative to basic income, or else talked about without mentioning basic income, which is kind of tactical.
Although I have to say those conversations wouldn't be happening without basic income, to be honest, anyway. Laura, you had a question? Sorry, yeah. We're just about out of time, so this will be our last question and then we'll take a break.
It's just Rebecca as well. You talked, it was really interesting hearing about the international trade unions work and how they're coming, people worldwide are coming together to push for better workers' rights. I wondered if there was any energy in the international trade union movement about basic income, or about having like a global floor, or basic income in any way.
Thanks.
Not to my knowledge, not so much explicitly, any sort of international, to this point that I'm aware of, examples of unions meeting specifically on that. It may be, I'm sure there has been some kind of high level discussion around this, perhaps the shorter work week as an aspiration. I think that should have been happening. It seemed like the unions for a while stopped calling for that, which I think was a mistake. It was a historical demand and now it's bubbling up again, but there was a bit of a time when it wasn't talked about so much. But yeah, not to my knowledge, I don't believe there's any sort of initiatives around that. It's very much, I think there's an emphasis on like the coalface, what's going on right now, how do we respond to conditions as they are, and a lot of that wider social stuff, there's not really the time or resource that's being dedicated into thinking about that.
What about anti-carbon emissions
Yeah, so Scott just asked about, is there an anti-automation sentiment in the unions? That could be a good thing to think about tomorrow. I know there's a panel on that. Up to a point, and again, I can't speak for everyone, I can only speak for my own experience. There has been concern about this, and particularly there's an interesting initiative in the UK, which I might bring up again tomorrow. So we had something called the Lucas Plan in the 70s in the UK, where workers who were part of factories that were making weaponry, among other things, were thinking about how they could repurpose their workplaces to produce different things that were socially useful. And to me, this really, I've thought about this in connection with basic income and how it would help us think about how we transition our jobs and change them and our industries. But there's actually a new Lucas Plan campaign getting started, and for some reason, it's quite anti-basic income as well as being anti-automation. It's just decided they've took a position that's quite anti-technological. Fair enough. So, but that's just one example.
Okay, thank you very much to the panelists. Yeah, so we had a lot of different issues brought up here about care, about work versus labor, about precarity and what that means. We didn't really talk so much about flexibility and the need for flexible time that a lot of people have, particularly people who do unpaid care work like women. But I think all of those issues will come into it. Thank you so much. I think it was a really rich panel with many ideas and experiences, and I hope that that's kind of sets us up for the rest of the afternoon. Okay, thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you. Yes, so another 15-minute coffee break now. Just before you leave, there's been one other room change. It says that the UVI, Art, Culture and Entrepreneurship, that's chaired by Enno Schmidt, that's now been moved from the gallery to Biblioteket, meaning the library. And we've also put up signs. So if you follow the signs, you should end up in the right session.
There are parallel sessions in other rooms that I hopefully will record.
Yeah.